In the spring of 1842, Mobile, Alabama was still in its golden age as one of the busiest ports in the United States. A series of events began to happen at the Price estate that would eventually lead to what local newspapers would later call the darkest chapter in Baldwin County's history. The Price family was well known in the area. Their plantation was about 15 miles north of Mobile Bay, in a place where the wind through the tall pines seemed to carry secrets that no one would say out loud. People in the area knew Nathaniel Price as a successful businessman who made a lot of money in the cotton trade. His estate, which he called Willowbrook, was a sign of his wealth. It was a grand manor house with white columns and acres of cultivated land that went on for miles. But there was something about the Price estate that made people feel uneasy, even though not many could say exactly what it was. Maybe it was the way the house seemed to watch from its perch on a gentle rise, with windows like empty eyes looking out over the fields. Or maybe it was how Nathaniel Price moved around the community. People respected him, but they never really knew him. Nathaniel Price came to Mobile in 1829, according to county records that were kept until 1963, when they were sent to the Alabama Department of Archives and History and then lost during a renovation. He was 32 years old, already very rich, and had a young wife named Ella Lanena with him. He became a successful businessman in just 3 years and built Willowbrook, which quickly became known for its beauty and the quiet that seemed to surround it like a shroud. The strange note in the margin of the St. Paul's Episcopal Church registry is what makes this case so interesting and has drawn the attention of historians for decades. The entry in Paul's Episcopal Church registry that records Elianena Price's death in childbirth in 1833. Someone unknown had written, "She knew. God forgive us. She knew. Doctor." Found the notation in 1951. James Whitaker from the University of Alabama was studying the death rates of plantation-class women in Alabama before the Civil War. He wrote about his findings in a little-known academic journal, but they were never widely read. A fire in 1968 badly damaged the church registry, leaving only Dr. Whitaker's notes show that this strange addition was made. After Ella Lanena died, Nathaniel Price stayed away from most people for 2 years. He came out with a new wife, Josephine Crawford, who was the daughter of a well-known family from Montgomery. The Crawford family papers, which were given to the Alabama Historical Society in 1954, contained letters between Josephine's mother and her sister in Virginia. In one of these letters, Josephine's mother said, "The marriage had been arranged quickly and with little consultation with Josephine herself." Martha Crawford wrote in a letter dated December 12, 1835, "I am afraid for my daughter." Mr. Price's demeanor suggests a man maintaining composure solely through willpower. It seems that the death of his first wife changed him in ways that are hard to put into words. Josephine doesn't say much, but I can tell that things aren't going well at Willowbrook. If only her father hadn't been so eager to make the connection. The Price family grew over the next few years. In a short amount of time, Josephine had 3 children. Thomas in 1836, Mary in 1838, and William in 1840. The Price family seemed to be doing very well on the outside. Nathaniel's business kept growing, and Willowbrook became known for its fancy but rare social events. But there were whispers among the household staff that eventually made their way to Mobile and beyond. Sarah Johnson, who served as a housemaid at Willowbrook from 1837 to 1841, gave a statement to the Mobile County Sheriff in April of 1863, more than 20 years after the events in question. The statement, which was found in 1,957 inches, a group of papers about property disputes after the Civil War, is one of the few first-hand accounts of life in the Price home. Johnson said, "The master was a quiet man, too quiet at times. He would sit in his study for hours and just look at the wall. I think the mistress was scared of him. I never saw him hit her, but the way she looked at him made it seem like she was waiting for something bad to happen. And the kids learned early on to be quiet when their dad was around. It was always so quiet in the house, like everyone was holding their breath." Sarah Johnson had no way of knowing at the time that Nathaniel Price was hiding a secret that would eventually destroy not only him, but everyone around him as well. A journal that was found hidden in the wall of the study during renovations to the property in 1965 said that Nathaniel had been doing things that would have ruined him and his family if they had been found out. The owner of the property at the time, Harold Wexler, looked at the journal for a short time before giving it to a local historical society. The journal had entries from 1,829 to 1,841. Sadly, a flood that damaged the Society's storage building in 1968 destroyed the journal. However, Wexler's memories, which were recorded in a 1972 interview with the Mobile Register, give us some idea of what it was about. From what I read, it was clear that Price was doing something illegal, Wexler said. There were mentions of payments and shipments, but they were all in a code. The most interesting thing to me was how his handwriting changed over the years. It started out strong and sure of itself, but by the end it was shaky and almost frantic. I remember the last entry saying something like, "The silence is no longer a shield, but a prison of my own making." I got chills when I read it. There has been a lot of talk about what Nathaniel Price was really doing. Some historians have posited that he may have participated in the illicit importation of goods to circumvent tariffs, while others have insinuated more nefarious undertakings. In 1959, graduate student Elizabeth Holbrook wrote a thesis at Tulane University that said Price might have been involved in the illegal slave trade, which had been made illegal in 1808, but continued to happen secretly for many years after that. Holbrook's research was never published, and her academic advisors reportedly told her not to do it because the topic was too sensitive and the evidence was not strong enough. Her thesis was put away and mostly forgotten until 1968, when it was mentioned in a footnote in another academic work. After that, it disappeared from the university's records during a transition in cataloging. No matter what Nathaniel Price was doing in secret, it seems to have gotten worse in early 1842. Shipping records from the Port of Mobile, which are kept in the city's Maritime Museum, show that ships linked to Price's trading company made a lot of trips to and from New Orleans during this time. They often came back with very little cargo or paperwork. At the same time, Price's company ledgers, which were found in bits and pieces in the papers of his business partner, showed that a lot of money was moving between accounts with little explanation. The events of May 1842 started to happen against this background. It looks like the arrival of a man named Edward Blackwood set things off. Passenger lists from the steamship Carolina show that Blackwood arrived in Mobile from Charleston on the 7th of May, 1842. There is no record of why he went to Mobile, but he got in touch with Nathaniel Price just a few days after he got there. A letter found in 1961 among the personal belongings of Judge William Harding, who was in charge of the Mobile Circuit Court from 1840 to 1855, gives some clues about their relationship. The letter, dated the 10th of May, 1842, and not signed, said, "N, the man from Charleston, knows everything. He says he has proof. We need to get together right away to talk about what to do next. Set this on fire. J." No one knows who J was, but some researchers think it might have been James Thornton, a well-known Mobile businessman who was known to have worked with Price. The letter was never delivered, it seems, because it was still sealed when it was found. It's not clear how Judge Harding is connected to the case, but court records show that he stepped down from several cases involving Price's business interests after 1842, saying he already knew the people involved. Different sources tell us what happened next, but the full story is still hard to find. A story in the Mobile Daily Register on the 2nd of June, 1842 says that Edward Blackwood stayed at the Harbor Inn, a nice place near the waterfront. People saw him go into Nathaniel Price's company's offices on May 12. The article's clerk said that the meeting between Price and Blackwood was short but very heated, with loud voices coming from behind the closed door of Price's private office. Blackwood left looking angry, and Price didn't come out for a few hours. The next day, May 13th, Blackwood was seen at the Mobile courthouse, where he asked to see shipping records and business registrations. Thomas Wilson, the clerk on duty, later said that Blackwood was especially interested in paperwork about ships owned by Nathaniel Price and his friends. Historians looked at court records in the 1,950 seconds that included Wilson's statement, which said that Blackwood had said something about bringing a great wrong to light before leaving with a lot of notes. Edward Blackwood went missing on the 15th of May, 1842. The last person to see him was the owner of the Harbor Inn, who said he had business to take care of and would be back by evening. The owner called the police and started a search when he didn't come back for 2 days. Blackwood's things were still in his room, including a leather portfolio that the first police report said had business-related papers and letters in it. The police took the portfolio into their custody, but it was later reported missing from the evidence room in July of that same year. No one has ever found any evidence of it. If it weren't for what happened at Willowbrook in the days after Edward Blackwood went missing, it might have just been another unsolved mystery in a busy port city. Sarah Johnson said that Nathaniel Price came back to the estate on the night of May 15th, very upset. He got home late, when everyone else was already in bed, she said. I heard him come in because I was up with William, who was sick. The master went right to his study and locked the door behind him. I could hear him moving around in there all night, and once I thought I heard him crying. The next morning, Price called his family into the dining room and told them they were going to their summer home on the eastern shore of Mobile Bay, near what is now Fairhope. They would be there for a long time. Johnson said that this news came as a shock because the family usually didn't move to their summer home until June or July, when the heat in the city became unbearable. Price also insisted that they leave right away with only the most important things. Johnson said, the mistress tried to ask why the rush, and he just looked at her with such coldness and said, Josephine, don't question me on this. You don't understand some things. I think the kids were scared by the way he spoke. They didn't cry or say anything. They just went to pack their things like little soldiers. The Price family left Willowbrook on May 17th. They left most of the household staff behind and told them to take care of the property while they were gone. Nathaniel told the staff that they would be back in about a month, but Johnson and others say that he seemed distracted, as if he were haunted. Johnson remembered. He kept looking back at the house as they rode away, like he was seeing it for the last time. Bayhaven, the summer home, was a smaller property about 20 miles from Willowbrook as the crow flies. However, the trip around the northern edge of the bay took a lot longer. James Foster, who drove Price's car and was one of the few staff members who traveled with the family, said that the trip was tense and mostly quiet. As part of a local historical society's effort to document the early settlement of the Eastern Shore, Foster wrote down his story in 1878. In it, Nathaniel Price keeps looking behind them, as if he is afraid someone is following them. Mr. Price wouldn't let her stop, Foster said, not even when the kids needed a break or when one of the wheels started to come loose. He kept saying, "We have to get to Bayhaven before dark." I thought it was strange, because the summer home wasn't ready for them, and there hadn't been any message sent ahead of time. The family got to Bayhaven just as the sun was setting on May 17. The property needed some work because it had been closed up since the summer before. Foster says that the first night was very uncomfortable. The family had to stay in the main room while Price wrote for hours at a small desk by candlelight. Foster said he wrote letter after letter and burned each one after reading it. I know because I could smell the paper burning, and in the morning there was ash in the fireplace, even though it had been warm all night. The Price family stayed at Bayhaven for the next few days, mostly cut off from the outside world. Foster was told to go to the nearest settlement, which would later become the town of Daphne, to get supplies. He was told not to talk to anyone about the family's presence or deliver any messages. He said that this isolation was starting to get to Josephine Price, who he heard arguing with her husband on May 20th. She was saying something about how they couldn't hide forever. Foster remembered, "And Mr. Silence is our only protection now," he kept saying over and over. I didn't get what he meant, but I had never heard him sound so scared before. In the meantime, the search for Edward Blackwood in Mobile was moving slowly. Authorities had talked to a number of people who had seen Blackwood while he was in Mobile for a short time, including 2 clerks from Nathaniel Price's company. According to an article in the Mobile Daily Register on May 25th, the article said that Price was currently out of town on family business and had not yet been interviewed. The article's tone made it seem like Blackwood's disappearance was a normal thing and not something bad. The most likely reason was that he had just left the city without telling his landlord. This changed a lot on May 28th, when a local fisherman named Robert Turner found a man's body washed up on a small, uninhabited island in Mobile Bay. The island is about halfway between the city and the eastern shore. The body was very decomposed, which made it hard to identify, but things found in the clothing, like a unique gold watch with the initials EB on the back, strongly suggested that it was Edward Blackwood. The coroner's report from May 30th said that the person died from drowning, but it also said that there were strange cuts on the wrists and ankles that looked like they had been restrained, and that there was evidence of a severe blow to the back of the head before the person went into the water. The news of the discovery spread quickly through Mobile, and the police now had a possible murder case to look into. Sheriff Thomas Reynolds led a group of police officers to Bay Haven on June 1st to question Nathaniel Price. People have put together what they found when they got there from different sources, such as the official report that Reynolds filed and later statements from staff members of the Price household who stayed at Willowbrook. There was no one in Bay Haven. Reynolds' report, which was kept in the county archives until 1966 when it was moved to the state repository, said there were signs of a quick departure. Food was left on the table, clothes were strewn about, and the door to the house was left open. There was no sign of violence or a fight, but it was clear that someone had suddenly left. A thorough search of the area around them turned up no sign of the Price family or their driver. When Willowbrook heard that the family had gone missing from Bay Haven, the staff had different levels of shock and worry. Sarah Johnson said later that some of the longer-serving staff members had a strange mix of fear and relief when they heard the news. She said, "There were people who whispered that it was finally happening, whatever it was, as if they had been waiting for something to happen for years." The police searched Willowbrook very carefully, paying special attention to Nathaniel Price's study. Sheriff Reynolds' report says that they found a hidden compartment under the floorboards that held a lot of cash, about $5,000, which was a lot of money in 1842, as well as some coded documents and a small leather-bound book that looked like a private ledger. These things were taken into evidence, but later reports said that they were missing from the sheriff's office, just like Blackwood's portfolio. Reynolds wrote in his report that the papers seemed to be about business deals that were out of the ordinary, but he didn't say whether or not they were legal. As the investigation went on, people started to wonder where the Price family might be. At first, people thought they might have escaped by sea, maybe to Cuba or Mexico. The Port Authority was told to look at all departures since May 28th, but they couldn't find any record of a ship carrying people that fit the description of the Price family. The search was broadened to include land routes, and law enforcement in nearby counties and states were asked for help, but these efforts also came up empty. James Thornton, Nathaniel Price's business partner, and the person who is thought to have written the unsigned letter that was found with Judge Harding's things, came forward with information at this point. Sheriff Reynolds interviewed Thornton on the 10th of June, 1842, and Thornton said that Price had told him a few weeks earlier about a situation that might require him to leave Mobile quickly. Thornton said that Price had talked about a piece of land in Florida, near what is now Pensacola, that he had bought through middlemen, and that most of his friends didn't know about. Sheriff Reynolds and a small group of deputies set out for the place Thornton had described with this information in hand. After 2 days of hard travel, they finally got to the property, which was a small farmhouse about 40 miles east of Pensacola. Reynolds' report from June 14th says that when they got to the house, an old couple was living there and said they had bought it from a land agent just a month before. They didn't know Nathaniel Price or his family, and a search of the property and the area around it didn't turn up any signs of them. When Reynolds got back to Mobile, he learned that the investigation had taken another turn. William Crawford, Josephine Price's brother, had come from Montgomery and was demanding action. Crawford was sure that something bad had happened to his sister and her kids, and he thought it might have been Nathaniel Price who did it. He said that the strange circumstances surrounding their disappearance from Bay Haven made him think that finding Blackwood's body was not a coincidence. "My sister wrote to me in April to tell me she was worried about how her husband was acting," Crawford said in the Mobile Daily Register on June 18. "She said he was getting more and more paranoid, sure that some unknown enemy was closing in on him. I'm afraid that this paranoia may have made him do things that were dangerous. Because of Crawford's involvement, both Willowbrook and Bay Haven were looked into more deeply. Records kept by the Baldwin County Historical Society show that a second search of Bay Haven on June 20th turned up something very troubling. Investigators found a hidden cellar in a small shed where gardening tools were kept. To get to it, they had to take off some floorboards. The cellar was about 6 feet by 8 feet and not very tall, so a man could only stand up in it. It had bedding, food, and a small oil lamp. Most importantly, they also found a doll that belonged to Mary Price, the middle child, according to the household staff. People started to think that Nathaniel Price might have hidden his family in the cellar before running away himself, maybe to confuse people who were looking for him. William Crawford suggested a more sinister interpretation, that Price had locked his family in the cellar before killing them, just like he had done with Edward Blackwood. The authorities searched the waters of Mobile Bay around Bay Haven as well, but they didn't find any bodies. As the summer of 1842 went on, the investigation started to lose steam. Sheriff Reynolds wrote a report on July 15th saying that all leads had been followed up on and that the case would stay open but inactive until new information came in. William Crawford went back to Montgomery, but he kept pushing for action by writing to different officials, including the governor of Alabama. His efforts didn't get him very far, and the Price family's disappearance slowly faded from public view. If it weren't for a series of discoveries made almost 10 years later, it might have stayed an unsolved mystery like so many others in the South before the Civil War. A bad storm in the spring of 1852 caused a lot of damage to Willowbrook, which had been empty since the disappearance. Nathaniel Price's creditors had taken over the property and sold it a number of times, but no one had lived there for long. People in the area said that the house was unlucky, maybe even haunted, but the religious leaders of the community told people not to believe in such things. The storm caused damage that needed to be fixed on the roof and one wing of the house. While they were fixing things, workers found a sealed space between the walls of what had been Nathaniel Price's study and the sitting room next door. The area, which was about 3 feet wide and ran the length of the wall, had a few interesting things in it. A man's suitcase, a set of women's jewelry that was later identified as belonging to Josephine Price, and most importantly, a packet of letters tied together with twine. The current owner of the property, a merchant named Henry Wilson, was told about the discovery. He had bought Willowbrook as an investment, not as a place to live. Wilson gave the things to the county sheriff, who at the time was Samuel Parker. Thomas Reynolds had retired a few years before. The letters, which were in surprisingly good shape after being hidden in the wall for so long, gave us our first real look at what happened in 1842. The packet had letters between Nathaniel Price and a number of people, some of whom were only known by their initials. The oldest letters were from 1839 and seemed to be about business deals of some kind. In letters from early 1842, the tone got more and more urgent, with repeated mentions of our arrangement being in jeopardy and the need for absolute discretion. One letter dated the 25th of April, 1842, and signed only T, which is probably James Thornton, said in part, "The Charleston man has been asking questions in all the wrong places. If he links us to the shipments from 1940 and 1941, everything will be lost. So far, your silence has helped us, but I don't think it will be enough anymore." There was another letter, this one dated May 5th and not signed, that was clearer. Blackwood sails for Mobile on the 3rd. He says he has papers that prove the violations. If he gets to the police, we'll all be in trouble. You need to stop him when he gets there and take any evidence he has. Do whatever it takes. But the most telling document was not a letter, but a journal entry written by Nathaniel Price on the 16th of May, 1842, the day before the family left for Bay Haven. It said, "I can't keep up this act anymore. I can't stand the weight of silence anymore. I didn't hit Blackwood, but his blood is on my hands." T tells me it was necessary, and that one life is a small price to pay to keep our business safe, but I can tell from Josephine's eyes that she thinks something bad has happened. The kids also know that something is wrong. They've gotten so quiet, and the way they look at me with those accusing eyes reminds me too much of Ella Yanena in her last days. We leave for Bay Haven tomorrow, but I don't think we'll be safe there. My sins have been with me from the start, and now they are closing in on me like wolves on a hurt deer. I have set up our trip south. If we can get to Cuba, maybe we can start over. I tell myself that this is to keep my family safe, but I really think I'm trying to save my own soul. God help me. I have turned into a monster in my search for wealth, and my silence has only made the darkness inside me grow. Sheriff Parker read this journal entry and the letters, and then sent them to the state authorities in Montgomery. The paper showed that Nathaniel Price and his friends, including James Thornton, may have been involved in illegal activities like smuggling or the slave trade. Edward Blackwood may have found proof of these activities. It was clear what the implication was. Blackwood had been killed to keep these crimes from coming to light, and Price had run away with his family to avoid being caught. With this new information, the police started looking into the Price family's disappearance again. On the 10th of June, 1852, James Thornton was arrested on suspicion of being involved in the murder of Edward Blackwood. At the time, he was still living in Mobile and had done well in the 10 years since his partner's disappearance. Court records show that Thornton first said he didn't know anything about the crime, but when he was shown the letters found in the wall at Willowbrook, he agreed to give information in exchange for a lighter sentence. The missing pieces of the puzzle were found in Thornton's statement, which was taken on June 12 and sealed by the judge until 1960. Thornton says that he and Price did bring slaves into the country illegally, even though it had been against the law since 1808. Their operation was complicated and well hidden. They used fake shipping documents and moved people around a lot to hide where they came from. In the end, they sold the enslaved people to plantations all over the Deep South. Thornton said that Edward Blackwood had worked for a group of Charleston businessmen who had put money into the business but were worried about getting more attention from the federal government. Blackwood had been sent to Mobile not to tell the police about the operation, but to get proof that the Charleston group could use to force Price and Thornton to give them a bigger share of the profits. Things got worse when Blackwood said he would go to the police with his proof if his bosses didn't do what he wanted. Thornton said that it was his choice to get rid of Blackwood, not Price's. On the night of May 15, he hired 2 men to kidnap Blackwood from his room at the Harbor Inn. The plan was to make Blackwood tell them where he had hidden his evidence and then kill him in a way that made it look like an accident or a robbery gone wrong. Something went wrong, though, and Blackwood was killed before he could tell them where the papers were. He had been weighted down and thrown into Mobile Bay, but the weights had come loose, letting the body float to the surface where the fishermen found it. Thornton said that Nathaniel Price was horrified when he heard about Blackwood's murder. Price was willing to do illegal business, but he had never thought about using violence. Price ran away with his family because he found out that his business partner had planned a murder and was afraid that Blackwood's disappearance would lead the police to their operation. Thornton swore that he had no idea where they were right now, and was genuinely surprised to find the hidden cellar at Bay Haven and the things hidden in the wall at Willowbrook. James Thornton was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and given a 20-year prison sentence. However, he only served 8 years before being released in 1860 because his health was getting worse, just as the Civil War was starting. The police kept looking for Nathaniel Price and his family, but they never officially found any sign of them. The case was finally closed in 1870, when Price would have been 73 years old and was thought to be dead. If it weren't for an amazing discovery made almost 10 years later, the story might have ended there, becoming a local legend and a topic of interest for academics. A bad storm in the spring of 1956 did a lot of damage to Willowbrook, which had been empty since the disappearance. Nathaniel Price's creditors had taken over the property and sold it several times, but no one had lived there for very long. People in the area said that the house was unlucky, maybe even haunted, but the religious leaders of the community told people not to believe in such things. While building homes near the site of the old town of Daphne, workers digging for a foundation found human bones. There were 5 skeletons found: a man, a woman, 2 children, and a teenage boy or young adult. Doctor looked at the remains. Harold Thompson from the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences said that they had probably been buried for about 100 years. The condition of the remains made the discovery even more interesting. It looked like all 5 people had been shot in the head and killed in the same way. They were buried together in a shallow grave that was carefully placed under what had once been a small outbuilding. The foundation of the building was still partially visible. The site was less than 5 miles from where Bay Haven used to be, but the summer home had been gone for a long time. Investigators found several items among the remains that helped them figure out who the dead people were. These included a signet ring with the letter P, a locket with a small picture of a woman who looked like Josephine Price, and 3 small silver coins from Spain that were the same kind that Nathaniel Price used to carry as personal tokens. DNA testing wasn't available at the time, but the circumstantial evidence strongly suggested that the remains belonged to the Price family and maybe their coachman, James Foster. Historians and police both looked at the case again after the discovery. The most popular theory that came out was that Nathaniel Price had planned to escape to Cuba with his family, but either changed his mind or was stopped from doing so. The secret cellar at Bay Haven made it seem like he had tried to hide his family while he made plans for them to get away. Something went wrong, though, and they all died. It is not clear if Nathaniel killed them himself in a moment of desperation, or if others, maybe sent by James Thornton or his associates, did. A deathbed confession from Reverend Thomas Wilson of the First Baptist Church of Mobile in 1962 gave this theory even more support. Reverend Wilson said that he had been called to the bedside of an old man named George Davis, who said he had worked as an enforcer for James Thornton in the 1,840 Davis, who was almost 90 and dying of pneumonia, told Wilson that Thornton had sent him and another man to take care of Price and make sure he stayed quiet after Thornton found out that Price was going to leave the country. Davis said they had followed the family to a small cabin near Daphne, where Price had been hiding out while he waited for a ship to Cuba. They killed the whole family, including the coachman, who had stayed loyal to Price on Thornton's orders. It is not possible to independently verify Davis's confession because he died before a formal statement could be taken. It does, however, fit with the physical evidence found in 1956 and gives a reasonable explanation for what happened to the Price family. If Davis's story is true, then the most ironic thing about the case is that Nathaniel Price's silence and refusal to tell the whole truth about his crimes or name his partners, even as he ran away from the consequences, did not protect his family, but instead led to their destruction. The story of Nathaniel Price and the terrible things that happened in 1842 still interest historians and the general public. The Baldwin County Courthouse, the last building connected to the case, was damaged in a fire in 1968. This is where the investigation records were kept. Most of the papers had already been sent to state archives, but some were lost, which means that some parts of the case will always be a mystery. The pieces that are left behind paint a picture of a man who made his own web and then stayed quiet as danger grew, which ultimately didn't protect the people he was trying to protect. Whether Nathaniel Price was a willing participant in the murder of Edward Blackwood, or, as Thornton claimed, an unwitting accomplice, horrified by the violence his associate had unleashed, his refusal to speak out to authorities, to his wife, perhaps even to himself, created the conditions for tragedy. Now, the area where Willowbrook used to be is part of a nature preserve north of Mobile. You can still see the foundation stones in some places, even though they are half buried under years of leaves and plants that are growing around them. People in the area say that on some nights, when the wind blows from the south and the moon is hidden by clouds, the air around the old foundation feels heavier, as if it is full of unspoken words and secrets that are too horrible to share. It might be a fitting memorial for a man whose silence turned into a prison and then a grave. Margaret Russell, a historian, wrote the most thorough academic study of the Price case in 1967. It is still the most thorough. She wrote something that seems very appropriate at the end. The tragedy of Nathaniel Price is not in his crimes, no matter how serious they were, but in his belief that silence could keep him from facing the consequences. By not thinking about the moral consequences of what he did and trying to protect his family's innocence by lying to them, he made a space that was eventually filled with violence His silence, which he thought would protect him, ended up being the thing that ruined everything he wanted to protect. According to Alabama laws about unidentified historical remains, the remains found in 1956 were eventually buried in an unmarked grave in the Mobile City Cemetery. The exact location was only recorded in documents that were sealed until 2011. The Baldwin County Historical Society put up a small marker in 1969 that says, "Here lie the victims of silence. May they finally find peace in the truth that they couldn't find in life." So, Nathaniel Price's story ends the same way it began, in silence, in shadows, and in the spaces between what is known and what will always be hidden. The sound of the wind through the pines that used to surround Willowbrook might be the only real epitaph he and his family will ever have. It's a sound that, like the silence Price worked so hard to create, means everything and nothing at all. But for those who have looked into this case using the few records that are still around, there are still echoes and ripples spreading out from that terrible spring of 1842. During the demolition of an old boarding house in New Orleans in 1962, a collection of letters was found. The building used to be a respectable place for merchants and travelers to stay, but over the years it had fallen into disrepair. Workers found a small tin box with personal letters, a tarnished pocket watch, and a few documents written in code under a loose floorboard in what used to be room 17. The Louisiana State Museum took the items, but they stayed in storage, uncatalogued, and mostly forgotten until 1965, when historian Robert Calloway found them while looking into something else. Calloway knew the find could be important when he saw that one of the letters was signed N. The letter was dated the 3rd of June, 1842, a week after the Price family had gone missing from Bay Haven. The letter, which was never sent and was only addressed to J, said in part, "We are safe now, but I fear it is only for a short time. The kids ask me every day when we can go home, but I don't know the answer. Josephine hasn't talked to me since I told her the truth that night. I can see in her eyes what I saw in Ella Lenena's before she died. The horrible realization that she has tied herself to a man whose soul is beyond saving. I write this in the hope that you can still get us out of this mess that I made, even though I know I have no right to ask you to do so. If you can't, I understand, and you don't have to do anything for me or mine. This silence is too heavy for me to bear alone." People are still guessing who Jay is. Some researchers think it could have been Judge William Harding because they found a letter in his things. Others have suggested that it might have been a family member or another person who was not already known to history. The letter suggests that Nathaniel Price and his family did escape from Bay Haven and make it to New Orleans, where they were probably going to Cuba, as he wrote in his journal. The other papers in the tin box have been harder to understand. They are written in a complicated code and seem to be records of some kind of transactions that took place between 1837 and 1841. We haven't been able to fully decrypt them yet, but the parts that have been decoded match up with James Thornton's confession about the illegal slave trade. One of the pages has a note in Nathaniel Price's handwriting that says, "This is the evidence of my damnation." This makes the documents even more important. May God forgive what men cannot. The pocket watch that was found with the papers has the words 2NP on it. May time give you wisdom. J.C. The initials J.C. correspond to Josephine Crawford, suggesting that the watch was a gift from his wife. The fact that it was among the papers shows that Price himself had stayed in the boarding house in New Orleans, but it's not clear if his family was with him. These new findings made people wonder what happened to the Price family. How could their bodies have been found near Daphne, Alabama, if they had already made it to New Orleans by early June 1842? George Davis's deathbed confession may hold the key. He said that he and another enforcer had followed the family to a cabin near Daphne. The Prices may have come back to the area around Mobile Bay after they first escaped. This could have been because their plans to get to Cuba didn't work out, or because Nathaniel decided to try to make up with his old partners. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Elizabeth Holden wrote a paper in 1972 that said the remains found in 1956 weren't even those of the Price family. Dr. Holden looked over the records of the discovery again. The actual remains had been buried again, and found a few inconsistencies. The estimated ages of the remains did not exactly match what would be expected for the Price family, especially the teenage boy or young man, since none of the Price children would have been older than 6 in 1842. The signet ring with the letter P on it was also a common style in the antebellum South, and it wasn't definitely linked to Nathaniel Price. It is completely possible, Dr. Holden wrote, investigators may have made connections that aren't supported by the physical evidence because the property is close to the old Price property and has items that are similar to those that belong to the Price family. In 1975, a graduate student named Thomas Jenkins found an entry in Cuban immigration records dated the 12th of September, 1842, that supported this theory even more. The entry said that a family named Parker, a man, a woman, and 3 children from New Orleans had arrived. What made this entry interesting was a note in the margin that said they had previously lived in Mobile, U.S. The difference in names is important. But it wasn't unusual for people who were running from the law to use fake names, which makes it more likely that the Price family made it to Cuba. An entry in the ledger of a plantation near Matanzas from 1845 that says N shows that the Price family may have made it to Cuba. Parker for his work as a bookkeeper and translator. Cuban historian Maria Rodriguez found the entry in 1983 while looking into foreign nationals in colonial Cuba. Rodriguez wrote in her paper that a lot of Americans who moved to Cuba during this time changed their names and jobs, especially those who might have had reasons to hide their past lives. After this point, the historical record becomes more and more broken. There are no more confirmed sightings of Nathaniel Price or a man who may have been using a fake name in Cuba or elsewhere. If the family really did escape to Cuba, their trail is getting cold. The most likely reason is that they lived in obscurity for the rest of their lives, maybe even moving to a new place where their past would be even less likely to follow them. What is most interesting about the case, though, is not where the Price family might have ended up living, but the psychological and moral aspects of their story. Nathaniel Price, as evidenced by his writings and the testimonies of acquaintances, was a man tormented by the repercussions of his moral compromises. His participation in the illicit slave trade, an activity deemed particularly abhorrent, even in the antebellum South, where slavery was institutionalized, had resulted in a trajectory of escalating isolation and secrecy. The silence mentioned in modern accounts was more than just a lack of willingness to talk about his illegal activities. It was, as psychohistorian Dr. In a 1988 study, Jonathan Friedman said that Price's whole approach to moral conflict could be seen as a metaphor. Friedman said, instead of facing the moral consequences of his actions, Price chose to compartmentalize them, putting them behind a front of respectability and domestic peace. The silence in his home was a sign of his refusal to think about the moral consequences of his actions. Sarah Johnson and other household staff's memories back up this interpretation. They all said that Willowbrook was a place of unnatural quiet, where even the kids learned early on to hold back their natural excitement. Johnson said in her 1863 testimony, "The master, he couldn't stand noise, not just loudness, but any kind of disruption to the quiet. He seemed to need that silence to keep his thoughts from getting too loud." We can see how this forced silence affects the family's mental health by looking at how they interact with each other. Josephine Price's letters to her mother, which are kept in the Crawford family papers, show that she was becoming more and more alone in her own home. "There are days," she wrote in October 1841, "when I feel like I might scream just to prove to myself that I still have a voice." Nathaniel spends more and more time in his study, coming out only to give orders or look at the kids with a look I can't figure out. Is it guilt? Are you scared? A feeling that doesn't have a name? No matter what demons are after him, he won't let them speak, and by doing so, he dooms us all to this half-life of whispers and unanswered questions. The Price kids also seem to have been affected by the oppressive atmosphere. William Barnes, Thomas's tutor, said that Thomas, the oldest, was uncommonly reserved for a child of his years, observing much but speaking little. Barnes wrote to his family in January 1842, "The boy watches his father with such intensity, as if trying to decipher some complex text written in a language he has not yet mastered. When you ask him a direct question, he often takes so long to answer that you start to wonder if he even heard you. It seems like he has to think about each word very carefully before he lets it out, which is probably something he learned from watching his father." This transfer of trauma from one generation to the next, which is what modern psychologists would probably call it, is one of the most moving parts of the Price case. Nathaniel's effort to keep his family safe by keeping them from knowing what he was doing ended up making their home a place where there were unspoken tensions and emotional distance. The silence he forced on them as a way to protect them turned into a prison for all of them, keeping each family member alone in their own private experience of a situation that was getting worse. When Edward Blackwood's investigation and murder happened, the carefully kept silence fell apart. Some evidence suggests that Nathaniel Price planned Blackwood's murder himself, while Thornton later claimed that it was James Thornton acting without Price's explicit consent. Either way, the outcome was the same. Price's fragile moral balance, which he had kept by staying quiet and keeping things separate, was permanently broken. The journal entry from the 16th of May, 1842, shows a man finally having to face the full consequences of his actions. "I can't keep up this act any longer. I have turned into a monster in my quest for wealth, and my silence has only made the darkness inside me grow." This moment of realizing who they were came too late to stop the chain of events that followed. The family's escape from Willowbrook, their desperate hiding at Bay Haven, and whatever happened to them in the end. In this way, the story of Nathaniel Price becomes more than just a historical mystery. It also teaches us about how moral silence can be harmful. Price's unwillingness to admit or talk about the real nature of his business, even to himself, set the stage for disaster. Each time he crossed a line without admitting it, it got easier, until he was guilty of murder and had to run away with his family into an uncertain exile. This interpretation is backed up by the limited archaeological evidence from Willowbrook. Excavations done in 1982, before the property became part of the nature preserve, showed that Price had made a number of changes to the house over the years, each of which seemed to be meant to make the rooms more private. The study had been changed many times, with walls made thicker and doors made stronger, making what the archaeological report called a fortress within a fortress. The hidden compartment under the floorboards and the hidden space between the walls where the letters were later found showed that the man was becoming more and more concerned with keeping things secret. A small silver key found in what used to be the master bedroom may be the most important thing found at the site. No locks on the property fit the key, and its purpose was a mystery until 1987, when Mobile Historical Museum curator Richard Townsend linked it to a small silver locket that a family with no known connection to the Prices had given to the museum decades earlier. The key opened the locket, which had a small picture of a woman inside. The picture looked a lot like Ella Lenana Price, Nathaniel's first wife, who we only have one description of. Inside the locket was a message that said, "Remember that once you say something, you can't take it back." We don't know if this was a message from Ella Lenana to Nathaniel, or something he wrote himself to remind or warn him. What is clear, though, is that the feeling it shows is very different from the code of silence that Nathaniel Price lived by and may have died by. In the end, the Price case is so interesting, not only because of the historical mystery or the unanswered questions about what happened to the family. It is how their story is a small example of bigger ideas in American history and human psychology. Price was involved in the illegal slave trade, which was one of the darkest parts of the country's history. Many people at the time, and since, have chosen to keep this part of history quiet. Price's personal moral compromise parallels a national one. His imposed domestic silence signifies a widespread societal reluctance to confront uncomfortable truths. Price's story illustrates the psychological consequences of harboring unacknowledged guilt and the inadequacies of compartmentalization as a means of addressing moral conflict. He tried to keep his business and family life separate by being one person in the counting house and another at Willowbrook, but this didn't work out in the end. He built walls, both real and imaginary, but they couldn't keep the results of his actions hidden forever. Nathaniel Price's silence has had effects that are still felt in surprising ways. While building a new courthouse in Mobile in 1991, workers found a small metal box that had been sealed into the cornerstone of the old building, which was built in 1872. There were papers inside that had to do with local history, including a handwritten account by Sheriff Thomas Reynolds, who had been in charge of the first investigation into the Price family's disappearance. Reynolds wrote about the events 30 years later, giving a point of view that wasn't in his official reports. He wrote, "Of all the cases that came before me as sheriff, none has kept me up at night more than the case of Nathaniel Price and his family. Not because justice failed, because I believe Price paid for his crimes, either by his own hand or someone else's, but because of what it showed about the nature of silence. In all my inquiries, I was struck by how many people thought something was wrong with Price's business dealings, how many people had seen him act strangely or heard rumors of problems, but none of them had said anything. It was like a conspiracy of silence, kept him safe until it was too late, when blood had been shed and lives had been ruined. Since then, I've often thought about how many bad things happen in the world, not because of the strength of the people who do them, but because of the silence of those who know but don't say anything." Reynolds' reflection brings us back to the main paradox of the Price case. Silence, which was meant to protect against the effects of wrongdoing, actually makes those effects worse. If Nathaniel Price had admitted to being a part of the illegal slave trade before Blackwood's investigation, he would have broken his own silence. This could have led to legal trouble for him, but it might not have meant the end of his whole family. His refusal to speak, on the other hand, turned a business deal into a capital crime, making him an accomplice to murder instead of a smuggler. The physical traces of Nathaniel Price and his family are mostly gone from the landscape today. There are only a few scattered foundation stones in a nature preserve that show where Willowbrook used to be. During a hurricane in 1926, the waters of Mobile Bay took back Bay Haven. The Baldwin County Historical Society put up a grave marker, but it is weathered to the point where it is almost unreadable. The case's records are mostly in pieces, spread out across archives and collections. Many of them were lost in fires, floods, or just because people didn't care. But the story lives on, passed down from one generation of local historians to the next, and each new scholar who finds a document or connection that had been missed before tells it again and again. It lasts because, at its core, it is not just a historical curiosity but a human story, a tragedy in the classical sense, in which a man's defining trait, his insistence on silence, becomes the cause of his downfall. In the quiet of the pine forest that now covers the site of Willowbrook, and in the sound of waves hitting the shore near where Bay Haven used to be, we might hear an echo of Nathaniel Price's last realization. That some truths can't be kept quiet forever, that some burdens can't be carried alone, and that the wall of silence we build to protect ourselves may, in the end, become our tomb.